Welcome back to Switch to Linux. Today we are going to ask the question, what is the best Linux distro that you could use? And there is no one right answer. We're going to look at this through a series of 5 questions. Ask yourself these 5 questions, get yourself the answer to these, and then maybe we can point you towards the right direction. Now, some people say there's too many Linux distros out there, and if everybody could just get together and build one Linux distro, then maybe the Linux distributions could, start overpowering Windows and Mac. And that might be true, but we might end up with just another version of Windows or Mac. There's a reason there's a lot of different distros. There's different philosophies on stability, different philosophies on upgrades, different philosophy on security. And we need to take into consideration these types of things. Now, another comment that I think I saw it on Chris Weir's video recently was that a lot of Linux distros are becoming very much the same. And I have multiple computers, and one of those is specifically dedicated to running and testing different distributions in more of a production type environment. Not as much production as I do here on this computer, but the production environments that you might find in a variety of different things. So testing out media, working with images, just general type of stuff. And he's very right that a lot of your distros are pretty much the same. It's just, does it work with certain hardware? What configurations do you need? And things like that. So that's kind of where we are going to use as a jumping point. Let's walk through 5 questions to determine which is the best Linux distribution for you. Number 1, what are your system specs? Now, the good news about Linux, and the reason there is not just one distro, is there's different Linux versions for different types of operating systems. Some people might still have 32-bit machines laying around that work perfectly well. You just can't get an operating system for it. Well, except for Linux. And you might have something like, I have here, one of my writing computers that I write my books on is this Lenovo, and this is a Lenovo 21SE. And this computer here, it has a soldered 32 gigabyte SSD, 2 gigs of RAM. It's not exactly a high-spec system. You put a Linux distro on this that is, requires more resources, it's going to be an unpleasant experience. But you pick the right Linux distribution, this thing is going to zoom along just as well as this very good video production machine that I have. Of course, for my all-purpose development computers I use for web design type stuff. This one is a Dell Inspiron. It's a 7000 series. I did upgrade the RAM to 8 gigs of RAM. This can get up to 16. I just happen to have the 8 gig sticks laying around, so that's what I used. It has a HD resolution monitor, and it is a Core 5, I think it's a 5th generation Core 5 processor. This one here can take a little bit heavier of a system resource. And so that's kind of what you need to determine. First, ask yourself the system specs. Now, there's a few things. Number 1 is the age of your computer. If you're dealing with a 32-bit processor, you need to find a distribution that still supports 32-bit. Linux Mint supports 32-bit. I can't remember if Peppermint does or not. Ubuntu dropped 32-bit, at least in most of the flavors. So you have to hunt around for a distribution that has a 32-bit processor if that's what you need. We already talked a little bit about RAM and processor. If you only have 2 gigs of RAM, you want to stick with something that is a lighter weight distro. So a desktop environment that would have something like XFCE or maybe Mate. You want to avoid GNOME, Cinnamon, Budgie. They're a little bit heavier on the system resources. They're going to take more RAM. But if you happen to have a lot of RAM in your computer, you got 8 gigs like in this thing here, I could easily put something running GNOME or Cinnamon or any of your other, pretty much any desktop environment would go on that just fine. But you need to know what type of RAM and what type of processor, so you're not putting something on there and expecting better performance than your system specs can get you. The other configuration that you need to be aware of is hardware. What type of hardware do you have? The one piece of hardware that will cause some problems internal to a computer, particularly a laptop, is your wireless card. This one has an Intel wireless card, and I know that it works very well out of the box with open source drivers and things like that. This Lenovo, because it's a really cheap computer, has what is called a Broadcom chip. Broadcom does not work very well with your open source world. There are drivers you can put on this, but they are proprietary. And that means that distributions like Fedora and other ones that are maybe Debian out of the box are very much want to only include your free and open source drivers, and so it's going to be a little bit harder to get those to work. You can do it for sure, it's just a little bit harder. So if you have a system like this with a proprietary or with a hardware specs or some component, the other big one, of course, is NVIDIA. Again, if you have a resource or a piece of hardware, wireless card, NVIDIA, video drivers, whatever, you want to make sure that you're picking a distribution that you can easily install the drivers or contains those drivers with them. So the latest version of Linux Mint, for example, has an NVIDIA specific live key. So if you're trying to live boot it and it has an NVIDIA driver in it, you will still be able to boot into it because it assumes for that. Of course, Linux and anything in the Ubuntu family should still have the driver resource tool that, as long as you can get that thing on the internet somehow, I usually just do it by using a USB wireless thumb drive there. Let me grab it out of the box there. I didn't grab it. Just grab yourself a little USB wireless key. This will work with your proprietary Linux drivers. So I put this in there, get wireless connection, and then go on to my driver manager, and then tell it to install the proprietary drivers for the Broadcom chip or the NVIDIA drivers. Now again, any Ubuntu-based distro has a tool that will do that. You don't generally have to fight with it. And that's the other consideration. So the age of your computer, the RAM, the processor, and your type of hardware under what type of system specs do you have. So research those before you determine the best distribution for you. Second question, and it may sound silly, but what is your preference for the OS stability? Some Linux distributions are a lot more stable than others. You don't want to be up there on the International Space Station and have your Linux distribution crash because it got some update. And that's precisely why the space station runs Debian. Okay, some Linux distributions take a much more conservative approach to how they roll and how packages are pushed out. So Debian, one of the reasons I live in the Debian family is because I just need stability. I have so many things, so many projects, so many things that I have to tend to. The last thing I have time to do when I haven't planned on it is fixing a computer. And so Debian breaks a little bit less than other systems. Now they do this through having a unstable branch where you can have a rolling type model. It's called Debian Unstable. Or they have the stable branch. The stable branch, generally, you can push updates on that, and it generally would not break your system unless some update were interrupted or got corrupted or something like that. Some people, though, really want, and particularly if you are working with the latest hardware, you are always on the cutting edge of things, you want to go with a system that rolls everything much more rapidly, in which case you want to live more in the Arch world. Neither one is the right or the wrong choice. It just depends upon what is best for your setup. In me, I'm not cutting edge. I don't necessarily want to push things. I don't push updates nearly as much as I should many times because I don't want to deal with the possibility of something breaking. Now, because I generally live in the Debian world, that's probably not going to happen. But I just don't like to turn on the computer and find surprises. And we'll come back to that in a couple points down the road as well. But the two questions that I ask myself here, number one is, what is my ease of fixing it? If I am kind of a computer noob and I want to switch over to Linux and I'm maybe getting help from somebody to get a system set up, but I'm not quite all that comfortable with trying to fix something, you probably want to be in a Debian branch because they break a lot less. So that's Debian, any Ubuntu derivative, anything like that. Linux Mint is good at this. Because you're probably not going to have to sit there and spend a lot of time fixing a system. If you are more of a computer tech guy, you're a savvy guy, and you're willing to learn and you have the time to learn, you're maybe in school still, you're living at home, you don't got to go out and make an income, a job, you probably want to live in the Arch world. And because it's going to teach you a whole lot more about computers, if something breaks, it takes more time to get it fixed. This is another thing with Fedora as well. It tends to roll itself. When it rolls, invariably something breaks. You got to spend the time to figure out how to fix it. And so your ease of fixing computers is number one. Number two factor is, do you have another computer laying around that if your computer goes all crazy on you, you can still get on, you can still do production stuff, and you can get on the internet and maybe look up some questions and answers as to what is causing your system to go. Of course, keep thumb drives around with Linux distributions burnt on these, so if something does go crazy and you're just like, oh boy, I really gotta work, you can take, and this is the power Linux, you could take this with an Ubuntu live key on it, plug it right in there, access the folders off your stuff, still get a day's work in. It's maybe not your best ideal setup, but you can still get your day's work in, even though your computer may or may not be working as well. So just consider that. What is your preference on your operating system stability? Number three, what is your preference for your desktop setup? And this is one that you might want to ask because there's different computers are set up in different ways. Of course, your two most popular ways of setting a computer are like your Windows type setup, where you have a taskbar at the bottom, maybe you have some icons pinned at the bottom to quickly launch applications. You'll have a menu which has everything else in there. Maybe you have a clock and some other system items over in the far right corner of your screen, and the rest of your screen is full. On a Mac, you'll have a single dock where you can dock things to. There is a menu that will show you all the applications, but it's more of a full screen type thing. And then there's some differences in how they function in between. Well, Linux will contain desktops which will look like either of those, and some extra things. You can have super lightweight desktops or just simple window managers that don't do much more than simple window management stuff. Or you can have an entire system that is completely radically different and just looks kind of out of the box. So you got to ask yourself, what is the format that you like? Of course, as people are asking this, I like to point you to a variety of different desktops here. So like this is Cinnamon. I like the Cinnamon desktop because this is set up nearly exactly like a Windows setup. And this is exactly how I'm productive. I work on a variety of different desktops, and I try the different distributions to see what is out there that works out well. And so for me, what I want to do is I like getting in here and experimenting with these different desktops so I can see what is it that I might like to run. So of course, we have the Windows type version. I'll show you a Mac version here in a moment. Okay, so this type of view here is a little bit more similar to a Mac. Of course, this particular version, which is Fedora, does not have a dock by default. You do have access to a dock over here when you click up here in your corner to get your activities, which you can also do with your Windows Meta key. And then this will kind of show everything. Of course, we have our show application. So this looks very much like Mac. Including if you put things into folders together. I got to remember how to get folders together. You can build folders together. And it will look very much like a Mac, how the setup is. Of course, it also runs your menus like a Mac, so all of your windows for whatever the current loaded application are will appear up here. And then there's a variety of different options. Now, of course, Firefox does have its menu built into itself, so it's a little bit different. But anything else that you'll have the applications to, the menu items will appear in the upper corner. So here we have Rhythmbox, and here you can see where the menu shows up. Very much similar to a Mac type feel. Of course, we have a bar built up here. Now, while I'm talking about this, let's look at, do you like the ability to customize things? Do you like an original type of look? So this is the GNOME desktop, or GNOME. GNOME or GNOME, either one is an acceptable pronunciation according to the Foundation. And this desktop here is focused on being very minimal. You pretty much can't customize it, and the downside is to add any type of extra features or functionality, you need to install extensions which are actually third party. And some people have concerns about that. Some people don't care about it. the GNOME desktop, the downside of it, depending on whether that is an upside or downside to you, one of the biggest downsides of the GNOME desktop is it is a much more system heavy system. So this one here, it is running a gig of memory on this, versus other desktops will run on a lot less. So next I'll show you one that is super light. So this desktop here is the XFCE desktop, and this is on Linux Lite. And this one here is a lot more system light. It doesn't take nearly as much RAM. So you can see this one here, actually this is running heavier than I expected it was. This is only running half a gigabyte though on the entire system. So very nice, very lightweight. It also gives you a Windows feel, more closer to like a Windows XP type feel. You can adjust your menu up and down. You can search for anything in here. So if you're looking for the web browser, you know what it is. You can search for it in there. And then there's all of your applications that are showed up over here. We can also use your desktop as with icons. This is something we didn't mention in the last one we looked at where you actually can't. There's a few extensions that will enable it. But by default, the GNOME desktop will not allow you to work on the desktop. This one does. And again, you can see it's very much like a Windows type feel. This is the type of desktop that I'm running on my Lenovo computer. I'm actually running Peppermint over there, which is kind of a combination of this and another lightweight desktop. But this desktop here is nice and lightweight. Okay, so this desktop here, this is called the Budgie desktop. Yes, it does get full size, just not on the live key that I'm showing here. This one will have some views a little bit similar to the Windows out of the box. Of course, you can edit and adjust all this. But the thing that sticks this one out is we have our sidebar notification panel. This one actually comes closer to combining the Windows type approach with the Mac type approaches. This is similar to the Mac notification bar and panel, but we still have our menu and your setup. Much like the Windows platform. So this is more of a hybrid type system. This one here is, it's kind of medium on system resources. It's not as light as the XFCE, but it's not super heavy either. So this is running about 800 megabytes out of the box. And there's a variety of different desktops. We could actually spend quite a bit of time looking at different desktops. So the ultimate take-home lesson here from looking at the different desktop setups are, what type of desktop do you like? Do you like something like very Windows-like? Do you like something very Mac-like? Do you like something that is completely its own thing, fairly unique, like the Deepin or the Solus desktop are a little bit more unique? And do you like customizability? If you want customizability out of the box, you probably don't want to go with GNOME or GNOME. But you might want to go with something like KDE, which we didn't look at here, which is a very customizable desktop. So there's a lot of those choices that you can make. So ask yourself that, what type of desktop are you looking for? Number 4, which package versions do you like? And we alluded to this a little bit earlier in point number 2 about turning on the computer and getting surprised. So package versions are, what version of the application are you using? Are you using GIMP 2.8 or GIMP 2.10? Or which version of LibreOffice do you have running? Does that matter to you? Some people really absolutely always want and need the latest and the greatest. But there are some people that what they have works exactly for me and I do not want it to change. Particularly the LibreOffice jump from 5.4 to 6 did actually change a lot of things in the menu that you use for more advanced things. So me, I write books, and so formatting and finally editing, LibreOffice 6 was different than LibreOffice 5. It's not like it was harder. It wasn't specifically easier. It was just different. I used to go to one menu to find something I needed to do. Now it's in another menu. Do you have time to relearn how to do that on random bases? Now, I use a Linux distro that does not roll and change my package versions. So they do not change except by my will. And so for me, what I did is I picked a time that was perfect for me, and I chose to change the software version to a different version. So that raises another one of those questions about the package versions. Do you like it to change versions automatically? Arch, Manjaro, And Debian unstable or Debian testing will generally do that. They will roll out package versions as they come out. Your traditional stable Debian, your Ubuntu branch, your Linux Mint, they will not change your package versions on you. So I'm running a Manjaro computer just off of screen right here, and if an update goes through and I had GIMP 2.8, all of a sudden now I will find myself on GIMP 2.10 simply because I ran updates. However, on the Linux Mint computer where we are going here, where it still has Linux Mint, still has LibreOffice 5.4 in the repo, it will never roll up to 6 unless I change the package base up to the Linux Mint 19 version, which I still have 4 years before I have to do that. And so, do you want things to automatically roll? Yes or no? But then, do you want the ability to roll it if you want to? There's some distros you are stuck with what it gives you, at least without a lot of extra complexities. One of the things I like about Linux Mint is it has and supports PPAs and the ability to add other repos. So what I did is there's a few application versions that I use on this computer that I'm recording this on that I had to force manually update. Audacity, Kdenlive, and not on this computer, but on my other one, LibreOffice, and maybe GIMP 4 as well. So on the computer over here, I've upgraded my Linux Mint 18, keeping Linux Mint 18 because I don't want 19 right now. Keeping this at Linux Mint 18, I have GIMP 2.10 on here, LibreOffice 6 on here. All right. On my production computer that I'm recording this on, I had to roll the Audacity to the latest version to get some plugins working that I needed for some other project I was working on. But the version of GIMP and LibreOffice are fairly inconsequential on this. I have the ability, by adding PPAs and repos, to roll those to the versions that I want. If I want it locked into a certain version, I can make that happen. Okay? And that is the question you need to ask yourself. Do you always want the latest and greatest packages? Or do you want packages that never really change? Neither one is absolutely right or wrong. It's up to your workflow, what you need to do. That's why I like the flexibility of Linux Mint. It does give me the older versions. The version of Kdenlive in the Linux Mint 18 repo doesn't actually work. You have to, and by the way, the Flatpak doesn't work either. What you need to do is you need to go in and install the latest stable repo directly into the system, which is easy to do. And so the other question is, can you install from .deb or .rpm files? That's important because, for example, things like printers, my printer, which you can see down there, is a brother printer, and the printer actually works with open source drivers, but the scanner doesn't. But the company makes the scanner drivers available as a .rpm or .deb. Now, that means I can install it on any Debian-based system. I can install it on anything that uses RPM Package Manager, but I can't install it on something cool and trendy like Solus. It just doesn't work. Not without, again, complexities that I don't want to get into. And so that's that next question. Which package versions do you want? Is that important to you? And you need to look around. Like, for example, I'll tell you why I rolled Audacity. I had to roll Audacity up above version, I forget which version I had, but I had to roll it up above the version that was in my repo because I'm working on producing audiobooks. And as I'm working on the audiobooks, there's some plugins that help do all the filtering that I need to exactly match the specs that I need for the audiobook distribution channels. And they did not work on the version of Audacity that was in here. So what do? Well, you go to Audacity's website, you find the stable repo, you plug it in, and then you update. And so that's exactly what I did. So that enabled me to work with a very specific version. Now, there might be times like OpenShot. OpenShot changed its version, and it made things a lot more complicated to use. And to keep using the older version, I had to roll back to a previous version. And that's a valid thing too. You might need to be stuck on a certain version to make your process work or make your process easier for you. There is no right or wrong. As a global thing, you need to ask yourself that question and determine which package versions. So let's just do a quick rundown on these ones here. If you need the same static package versions, you want to look at Debian branches, Ubuntu, Linux Mint. These are going to give you very consistent, very stable packages. You should also get that on OpenSUSE Leap, which is not rolling. But if you need the latest and greatest packages, anything on Arch, including Manjaro, Antergos, those will roll. Your OpenSUSE Tumbleweed, which is a rolling distro, will roll, and your Debian Unstable or your Debian testing branches, those should also roll, although I'm not 100% sure how much those do roll. But they should roll a little bit. So if you need the latest versions, look at those latter ones. If you need the stable ones, never really changing, go to the former one. Particularly anything Ubuntu-based, you have the older versions in there, but you can choose some applications to roll up if you want to. And that's how I rolled up GIMP 2.10, LibreOffice 6, and Audacity to the latest versions, is simply by very easily adding the repos to the repository list. Number 5, what type of support do you need? And this is important because some distros have a lot more documentation and support, some of them don't. Some of them have a reputation of being a lot more new user-friendly, and some of them have a reputation of being not quite so new user-friendly. And so you have to ask yourself that particular question. What degree of help do you need? Are you okay if someone's kind of a jerk and says, read the manual pages? Or do you actually need somebody to walk you through it a little bit better? Do you need more documentation or not? I would say if you're new to Linux, my recommendation to you is stay in the Ubuntu family, because there are 2 big Ubuntu forums that will answer pretty much any question you would ever have. They're answered well, and they will work on any version of Ubuntu and any version of anything derived from Ubuntu for the most part. You're going to get a lot of help there. If you're more of a hands-on, you want to learn how to do it, and you need the occasional kick in the pants, try out Arch. Their forums are a lot more technical, a lot less user-friendly, but at the same token, you're probably going to learn quite a bit more. Some distros like Fedora also have a lot of user support to them because they're just huge distributions. They're reputable distributions. Particularly Fedora, you'll find yourself utilizing the help boards a lot more than you will on some of the other ones. And that's not a bad thing. It's just some of these differences. So be aware of the amount of support that you will get. If you get into something like one of the distros I'm not a big fan of is Elementary. One of the reasons is because from version to version on Elementary, as things change, previous types of fixes no longer fix the same things. Which is kind of funny because it's Ubuntu-based, but it's like they're hostile to older version of fixes. I don't know why, it just happens to be the case. So you want to be able to find information to fix things if you want to. Solus is not bad, but it's a little bit limited in this area because it's so new and it's not based on anything else. Debian has a huge history of it, but I don't recall there having quite as much documentation and as much user support. You can generally find stuff, but it's a little bit harder. Ubuntu, by hands down, is the easiest issues to fix and to get help with. They have the friendliest forums, the best, the most comprehensive forums. So just be aware of what type of help you're going to need, and are you going to be able to go to those various locations for that type of help. So thanks for coming along on this video, and let me know your tips and the questions you ask yourself down below. I hope you've enjoyed this video from SwitchedtoLinux. If you'd like to help support the channel, check out the links at the top. There is another video over here. You can check out our Patreon page down here. And you can check out shop.switchedtolinux.com for information on a t-shirt like this or some other designs. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.